Hi, I'm Corey from the Trade Justice Education Fund. I'm going to give you a really quick overview of why trade policy matters to the climate justice movement, why trade is part of the Green New Deal, and what we should be advocating for moving forward. Modern trade agreements usually have dozens of chapters. They can easily be hundreds, if not thousands, of pages long. They're detailed, complex documents, but they're not too complicated for regular people to understand. A lot of Americans already understand and are rightfully very angry that these trade pacts make it easier for big corporations to move jobs from here in the US to different places around the globe where workers are even more exploited and environmental regulations are even weaker. The US has seen millions of once good paying jobs sent abroad as a result of this, and these deals have also put a very real downward pressure on wages and benefits of the jobs that are left. This is reason enough to oppose these deals, but these trade deals' impacts on climate change is even bigger. In addition to offshoring jobs, lowering wages, increasing inequality, modern trade agreements also prevent countries from restricting trade in fossil fuels. They give corporations new tools for attacking climate policies, and they enable the throwaway consumer culture that's responsible for a big part of our climate problem. I'm gonna go through each one of these one at a time. So let's start by talking about the simplest way trade agreements can prevent climate action. At their core, these deals require countries to remove restrictions on the movement of goods across borders, quote unquote free trade. Oil, coal, and natural gas are all goods that are traded across borders, and they're not excluded from that. And so government actions that limit the export or import of fossil fuels can be considered a trade agreement violation. Things that trade deals prohibit can include a literal ban on the export or import of fossil fuels. Related to that would be a quota that restricts the volume of fossil fuels allowed to leave or enter a country. Any sort of indirect restriction on in fossil fuel is also covered. So if you start telling companies that they can't frack for oil and gas anymore, that obviously limits their ability to trade in oil and gas. And if you start telling companies they can't build oil pipelines or natural gas export terminals, that limits their ability to trade oil and gas. So if your ultimate goal is to leave fossil fuels in the ground, that's simply not allowed in modern trade agreements. The second way that trade agreements hurt climate action is by giving transnational corporations new tools to attack the laws, regulations, and even the court decisions of the countries they operate in. Either directly themselves or indirectly through governments, trade agreements empower corporations to sue over policies that they think interfere with their trade investment rights spelled out in trade deals. These cases aren't heard by US courts or any other country's domestic judicial system. Instead, they're heard in front of an international panel of corporate trade attorneys. These tribunals can't literally overturn a country's laws, but they can impose fines worth billions of dollars, such that if a country doesn't want more and more costly cases brought against it, it changes its policies to avoid that. So let me just give you a few examples of how individual corporations and governments acting on corporations' behalf have used trade deals to attack environmental rules. When Quebec, Canada introduced a moratorium on fracking under the St. Lawrence River, a US-based oil and gas company used a trade agreement called NAFTA to sue them, demanding nearly $250 million in compensation for the company's loss of expected future profits. So, if taxpayers have to pay oil and gas companies not just for what they've already invested in order to get them to stop polluting, but for their expectations of future profits if we were allowed them to keep polluting indefinitely, that's just not a possible, feasible way to move forward or achieve anything climate justice. So this is a pretty clear example of how corporations view trade deals as a way to overturn the work done by climate campaigners. Another clear example of this is when the Obama administration refused to grant permits for the Keystone XL pipeline, a project which would have moved dirty tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, down to refineries and export terminals in the Gulf of Mexico. The company behind the pipeline, TransCanada, announced they were also going to use NAFTA to demand $15 billion in compensation, which they've since renewed that threat as with the developments with the Biden administration. TransCanada only dropped their case when the Trump administration agreed to both grant them the permits needed to allow the pipeline to continue and also drop a requirement that the company use American-made steel and pipe in the project. So hopefully these two examples give you a clear idea of how trade agreements threaten action to reduce climate pollution. But it's not just policies that restrict fossil fuel projects that are at risk. It's also trade deals that can be used to attack government's green energy projects. In 2019, the World Trade Organization ruled against solar panel incentives put in place by the states of California, Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Montana, and Washington. That case was brought by the government in India in retaliation for a case brought against India by the US uh, for the use of solar panels. There are dozens and dozens of other examples of these types of cases. Corporations have already successfully used trade pacts to attack parts of the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Marine and Mammal Protection Act here in the United States. And frankly, the environmental rules of smaller developing countries have been attacked or just completely disregarded. Finally, as I said before, by offshoring good paying jobs from the US and other countries, to other countries to sweatshops, our trade agreements also enable throwaway culture, especially when it comes to consumer electronics. Not too long ago, if your television or vacuum cleaner or electronic equipment in your home broke, you'd bring it to be repaired. There was an expectation that these goods would last, if not for a lifetime, for at least several decades. Today, a lot of people expect to have a new cell phone, computer, video game console every few years. These short life cycle products, which are made with toxic chemicals and with metals that require mining and excavation to dig up, are all shipped around the world. They are incredibly harmful to our environment and even more harmful when you consider that they're shipped back into landfills. If companies had to pay their workers decent wages and benefits rather than just pennies on the dollar overseas, this environmentally destructive business model wouldn't be feasible for them economically. And that's just to say it wouldn't be profitable for them to utilize sweatshop labor and these cheap short life cycle products. So there are environmental benefits to stopping offshoring of jobs and forcing corporations to pay higher wages. Obviously, this is just a quick snapshot overview of the climate impacts of the existing trade policies, but hopefully it's enough to make you realize how significant the problem is. Here are some examples of how trade policy could be done differently to reduce climate chaos rather than accelerate it. First, trade agreements should include strong climate standards with swift and certain enforcement mechanisms. Instead of using trade deals to enforce things like Hollywood copyrights, big pharma medicine patents, and the so-called investor rights of oil and gas companies, we should be using trade deals to enforce internationally agreed upon climate treaties. Related to that, our trade deals should also include strong labor standards and other human rights standards, protecting workers' rights and raising wages around the globe. Beyond being the right thing to do in general, it will also help us shift away from short life cycle manufactured goods more quickly. We also need language in our trade deals that says whatever environmental and labor standards are adopted internationally are floors rather than ceilings, meaning that governments at both the national and local level need to meet those international standards as a minimum, but they're free to enact stronger standards for their own countries and communities if they choose to do so. Those standards can't be attacked through trade agreements. Finally, trade agreements should allow countries to explicitly tax imports of carbon heavy products from countries with weak climate regulations. That would first that would first disincentivize the use of dirty products, and second, raise money for climate projects that can offset the use of products while they're being phased out. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Trade policy actually has a really large effect not only on climate policy, but even the actions of climate organizers and climate justice. So I hope that we, keep up to date with this topic, and we have a social media kit with climate and trade policy that we can share. Thank you.